Very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Liz.
So, Ken, you guys had this statement that you put out, and just a couple of highlights. We talked anti-recovery budget, a chilling message to New York's employers, a confidence killer. I mean, those are some pretty strong words. I'm going to hazard a guess that you are not pleased.
No, we're not pleased. I mean, it really is a very serious problem, and it's evidence again that there's this persistent denial by so many folks in Albany of economic reality, the economic reality everybody faces all across the rest of the state. So, for instance, think of it this way. There are close to 1 million New Yorkers that are out of work, and I'm sure a lot of them, sadly, are watching the show. And there is no hope in this budget. This budget gives them no hope. This budget gives them no message that the legislature, that this whole process has really done anything to create private sector jobs in New York State. And when we say that it's really a chilling message to business owners or an anti-recovery budget, it's because despite the cuts you mentioned a moment ago, Liz, this budget grows spending. So yet again, we have a budget, despite all the noise about cuts and this $9 billion gap that was the sort of big challenge at the onset of this process. Despite all of that noise, at the end of the day, this past Tuesday night, state spending went up in the new budget, and that defies economic reality.
Okay, so what would the council have preferred to have seen? I mean, I know that there were some revenue raisers that you would have preferred, and then some things that happened in the Senate that was one House bills that you really didn't like. Preferring wine and grocery stores, would that have been something that the council could have supported?
Well, we think that's a very reasonable way to raise revenue. It had wide support all across the state. It defies common sense that it was not enacted, but I'll go to something bigger than that. The new budget, Liz, has a proposal. I mean, it's in law now. It's going to take effect immediately, by which the state is going to renege on tax credits, on paying out tax credits for the next 3 years and that are worth over $2 billion. So that's like saying for the next 2.5 years, because we've already started this fiscal year, that businesses that earned a tax credit for creating jobs, for cleaning up a brownfield site, for building a new building, and Fair and Square did a deal with the state of New York, that now the state's not going to pay. They're going to defer the payment, they say, until 2013. That's a huge hit, and that's the kind of thing that's what I mean by confidence killer. If the state now is perceived, and it will be, as the place that doesn't keep a deal, how are we going to get businesses to take New York seriously?
But there's no money, right? I mean, isn't that the problem? The problem is that there was this massive $9.2 billion deficit. There was about $1.1 billion that was supposed to come that the state was relying on from the Medicaid money. Now, not only 2/3 of it is coming. And, you know, I mean, where is it going to come from exactly?
We would have argued for greater cuts to school aid, to Medicaid, and more efficiencies to state government itself. For example, a hard hiring freeze or pay freezes or furloughs, even layoffs of state workers. None of that happened. There could have been significant savings just from doing an across-the-board hiring freeze. In other words, state and local governments would, for, let's say, a 1-year period, not fill vacant positions, just no new hires. That alone saved over $1 billion. Those things with the state workforce, they didn't make it to the on the table. They didn't get any kind of serious consideration.
Not yet.
So not yet. But the point being, when you have this persistent problem of rising expenses and falling revenue, you're always going to have what they call the structural deficit. I mean, the budget was done Tuesday night, and already, if you ask Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, they'll tell you there's an $8 billion deficit projected for next year. So they haven't fixed the problems. The fix is reduce spending.
Okay, let me ask a question here. You know, what's interesting is there are a lot of competing interests in business. You have a very disparate group of people that are under the umbrella of the Business Council, right?
Right.
Okay, and they sort of individually put a lot of money into the political system, and each one of them has a voice. Each one of them lobbies very hard. For example, I don't know, the soda industry lobbied quite hard and poured lots of campaign contributions into the coffers of elected officials, and they killed the soda tax that Governor Patterson wanted to enact. But why is it then that the business can't collectively get together and really, it seems like they should be able to push the agenda? Instead, you see more, shall we say, liberal interests pushing the agenda, like, say, the Working Families Party or labor and state employees unions. I mean, what is it that isn't working, in your opinion?
That's a great question, and something at the Business Council and with working with other business organizations around the state, frankly, we grapple with that all the time. There are disparate interests, and sometimes some sector of the economy, some group of businesses will want one thing at the expense of somebody else, but generally what we've got to do is rally everybody to a more common solution. And that's a solution where there is this understanding that we simply are living beyond our means, that New York State can't afford $135 billion a year because the economy, the private sector economy, which we tax to generate the revenue, can't sustain that. It can't afford that. So the general view has to be we've got to dial back spending more than we did this year. Yes, there were some important reductions, but they didn't go far enough, which is why at the end of the day we've got a bigger budget this year than we did last year, even though we're stuck in this terrible recession, maybe seeing a jobless recovery, right? With, as I say, close to 1 million people in New York out of work. So I go back to this idea, Liz, that we've got to find a way, and you're right, business groups around the state, we need a louder, more organized voice, and we're certainly trying to drive that at the Business Council. But we've got to stick to these basic, I call them sort of big picture reform principles. We have this effort called 5 to Survive. A state spending cap, a property tax cap, lowering taxes in general, pension reform, debt reform, basic reforms to ratchet back and live within our means.
Okay, these are things actually that are all things that Andrew Cuomo is espousing. Also, some the Republican candidates. I mean, certainly we heard Rick Lazio just talking about, you know, the need to rein in spending and how he doesn't believe Andrew Cuomo can do it, et cetera. The Business Council played a very large role in the 1994 election when Governor Patterson, then Senator George Pataki ousted Mario Cuomo, who was then the governor. There we go. Is the Business Council going to take an active political role in this gubernatorial race?
We are already starting to take a more active role in races around the state. And what's very interesting, Liz, and you just mentioned it, is that really for statewide races, because if you take the races, the governor's races you mentioned, and then the comptroller's race with Tom DiNapoli, Harry Wilson, if you take these statewide races, there is already broad support, consistent support for those 5 fundamental reforms that I mentioned. And you're right, they come right out of the big policy tome Attorney General Cuomo produced in late May. And so what we're trying to do at the Business Council now is drive this agenda through the legislature, because that's where whoever the next governor is, when in January that person wants to advance these common sense reforms, which are already established in many other states and which are our path to economic recovery, the resistance will be in the legislature, most likely in the Democratic-controlled Assembly and in the, right now anyway, the Democratically controlled Senate. So what we're trying to do with our 5 to Survive campaign is survey everybody running for office, candidates, insurgents, incumbents, and say, do you support these 5 reforms or not? We want to build that support at the local level over the summer and into the fall so the next governor will have a leg up on that whole process.
So, and that is actually a fascinating campaign, and we're going to have to catch up with you more a little later about it because unfortunately we're out of time. But I want to thank you very much, Ken Adams of the Business Council, for joining us this evening.
Great.